Thank you, first of all, Matt, and I'm so thrilled to be here, honored to be here. I know it's been I'm number 10 of 15, so it's been an invigorating and yet long couple of hours. I'm hopeful that we can keep the momentum and the energy going, and truly to see your faces and to hear all of these conversations about mental health and mental well-being and hope and all these different facets is inspiring to me. As Matt said, I have been in this field for a little while, and when we all started, there was no conversation about mental health, and there was no conversation about wellness or hope or preventing suicide or any of that. And to see this evolve and to see these new voices is really pretty phenomenal. So I am Alison Malmon. I am the founder and executive director of Active Minds. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about my story, about Active Minds and building a movement, and about our tagline, which is changing the conversation about mental health, which to us, means starting a conversation, infusing the voices that need to be heard, and making sure that we're using the language that is supportive and makes this conversation one that really helps our community as we continue to heal. So my story is a story of my brother Brian. This is a picture of me and Brian circa 1998. As you can tell, Brian and I look very similar. He's actually 4 years older than me and about a foot taller than me, but otherwise he was a male reincarnate of me. Brian and I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. in Montgomery County, Maryland. Went to one of the prestigious blue ribbon public high schools in Montgomery County. Brian was a superstar. He was the president of our school's debate team. He was the soloist in our annual rock and roll revival show. He loved sports, but was awful at them. So he ended up being the announcer for the school's football games and basketball games, and he covered our high school sports in our local gazette. He was smart, he was funny, he had, by his senior year, he was taking only AP classes, 3.8 GPA, you name it. He was a star. Brian got into his top choice college, which was Columbia University in New York. He had high hopes of owning one of Trump Towers one day. So as I was entering high school and having to live up to the high standards that he had set for the Malmon name there, Brian was on his way to Columbia. And when he got there, he did what we are all told we're supposed to do to make college the best time of our lives. And I will put that in quotes because I absolutely actually hate that phrase. When you're in it, college is not the best time of your life. It can feel daunting and overwhelming. You feel stressed, you feel overwhelmed, and yet you think that everybody else is having the best time of your life. And your parents and grandparents say, oh, this is going to be the best time of your life. And so you think that there's something wrong with you and that you're not utilizing this experience the way you should, and this pressure on yourself. And if any one of us thinks back to college, I loved college now, however many years later. When I was in it, I was not necessarily loving it. So I actually think we have a problem with our language from the very beginning. College is not necessarily the best time of your life. You can have incredible experiences and make incredible friends, but there are no students I know who are walking around and every day would say, I'm having the best time of my life. And instead, we're actually causing students to feel as though they're the only ones, and there's something wrong with them, and that's a problem, and that's something we need to change. But Brian did what students are told to do to make college the best time of your life. He immediately submersed himself in activities and academics, making a whole new name for himself once again and a whole new group of friends. In his first week there, he joined an a cappella group. He also started writing for the school newspaper, the Columbia Daily Spectator, as a sports columnist. Again, loved sports, awful at them, so he decided to write about them instead. Brian was really funny, actually, and took after Tony Kornheiser's style of writing. And so he had a sports column in the Columbia Daily Spectator. He was interested in poli-sci and journalism. Wasn't really quite sure what he wanted to do professionally, but was actually quite a talented writer and was also interested potentially in law, something that would make him the money that he could own one of Trump Towers one day. Fast forward to senior year, Brian had become president of his a cappella group. He was the sports editor of the newspaper in addition to being a columnist. He had a 3.85 GPA, Dean's List every semester, an incredibly accomplished student at an Ivy League university. But in November of his senior year at Columbia, Brian went to the school's counseling services. It was a Friday afternoon that he had an appointment, and he was presenting with signs of depression and anxiety. November is midterm season, and so it was, not all typical to be experiencing these things. But Brian was struggling a great deal, and since it was a Friday, since Columbia and Maryland are pretty close, the therapist that he saw that day recommended that he come home for a weekend just to relax and de-stress. My mom is a social worker, a clinical social worker. We come from a very supportive family, and the therapist recognized that. Brian acknowledged that, and he said, "Yeah, okay, let me hop on a train. I'll go back home and just relax." So he came back home that Friday afternoon, but instead of going back to school on Monday, he actually stayed home and went to visit a local friend of the family, a local clinician who my mom knew, because it was only at the time that Brian came home that weekend that we realized, and my mom really realized, that what he was dealing with was probably a little bit more intense and severe than stress around exams, and something that just needed a weekend at home to relax from. And so he went to see the local clinician that Monday, and actually ended up seeing that person Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday of that week. And for all of you who have been in the mental health system, it's pretty atypical to go to see somebody 4 days in 1 week. But he saw that person that often because that clinician, that therapist, recognized that what Brian was dealing with was far more severe than we had ever had any idea of. Fast forward a little while, Brian ended up staying at home. He ended up staying at home through that week, through the rest of November, through the Thanksgiving holiday, through the semester, and he ended up taking a voluntary leave of absence from Columbia and actually staying at home for the rest of his senior year. At home, he started in pretty intensive treatments, trying to really figure out what this was, what the severe issue was. Our best diagnosis after a little while is schizoaffective disorder. Brian was dealing with severe depression and psychosis. He was hearing voices. And it was only through these consultations with these therapists that we learned that he had been dealing with this, that he had heard his first voice in February of his freshman year at Columbia. He had gone through his entire college experience through the best time of his life, making it the best time of his life on the outside, but he went through it hearing voices, feeling so depressed at times that he couldn't go to class. And we look back, and he had actually told us he had mono, which is why he was sleeping through class, but we later discovered that it was depression and it wasn't mono. But Brian was embarrassed, he was ashamed, he didn't understand what was going on, and so the last thing he was going to say to us at that time was that he had depression, and that depression was causing him to miss these classes. It was much more okay to say that it was mono. And it was only through this intensive treatment cycle and seeing doctors and everybody under the sun that we really learned all of this and really uncovered Brian's experiences. And it was devastating. It was devastating to all of us, both to learn what Brian was dealing with, but to understand that he had dealt with this for 3 years before telling any of us. My mom is a clinical social worker. Let me remind you of that. She goes through this on a daily basis and yet couldn't identify it in her son because her son had hid it from her. He hadn't felt comfortable telling us. He hadn't felt comfortable telling me, his kid sister, who looked just like him. Brian and I were two peas in our pod. Our parents were split up. They had split up years prior. And the fact that he didn't feel comfortable telling me what was going on in his mind devastated me. He stayed at home. As I said, he took a leave of absence from Columbia. I graduated from high school. It was his senior year there, which was my senior year of high school. So this was my senior year. I graduated from high school. I went off to college in Philadelphia. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. And Brian was still at home. He was taking guitar lessons. He was watching reruns after reruns of The Simpsons. He was writing for the Washington Post. He had gotten a job writing for the Washington Post. And he was talking about going back to school. He really wanted to go back to Columbia and graduate from where he started. My parents were talking about him potentially going to the University of Maryland, AU, Georgetown, GW. But he really wanted to go back to Columbia because to him, success only meant graduating in 4 years from the school he had started from, because we never learned that lesson. Students never learn that lesson, that it's okay to take 5 or 6 or 7 years to graduate, where it's okay to transfer, and it's okay not to finish where you started, because you may find a different path for yourself. But that was never a message that Brian heard or really internalized, and so for him, not graduating in 4 years was hard enough, but he sure as hell was going to do it from Columbia when he did. So I went off to Penn, and I did what you're supposed to do to make college the best time of your life. I joined a bunch of groups myself, but was still kind of connected to home because I didn't quite get what was going on. I was 18. I knew my brother was home, but beyond that, I didn't understand mental illness. I didn't understand schizoaffective disorder. I didn't understand how my big brother, who for 18 years of my life was one thing, and then all of a sudden he was acting a little bit differently, or he was feeling a little bit different, and it was tough for me. I came home for spring break. I was a cheerleader in college, and when I was there, University of Pennsylvania had a powerhouse basketball team for the Ivy League, and so we always got an automatic berth to NCAA tournament. And so my freshman year, Penn won Ivies, and so I got to go to tournament. So I came home for spring break. Brian drove me back to the train station. I rubbed it in his face that I was getting to go to tournament because, remember, he was the one who loved sports. And so he took me back to the train. I went to tournament. I bought him a T-shirt. Called him from tournament, told him I bought him a T-shirt, came home on that Tuesday, and then I got a call 3 days later that Brian had taken his own life. He was 22 when he died, should have graduated college just a few months prior. I still have that T-shirt in my drawer to this day. This was 15 years ago. And so I stand up here talking to you as a suicide survivor of my loss, and as a survivor of the ensuing grief and desperation that occurs for every suicide loss survivor. Brian was my only half. Our parents were divorced, and so my family has navigated this system of grief and this system of being suicide survivors. And yet the feeling that I experienced most strongly after Brian's death was fear. It was grief, it was pain, it was guilt. It is what you would expect, but it was also fear. Because Brian had started experiencing a mental illness in his freshman year of college. We found out later that his friends had noticed some changes in him. They had noticed him not acting like himself, but they didn't say anything. They wanted to respect him. He wasn't saying anything, and so they wanted to keep it quiet too, out of respect. There were opportunities for them to step in and talk to him and say, what's going on? Brian hadn't felt comfortable seeking help until 3 years later, which in my mind was just too late for him. While we were able to control the psychosis and the voices after he came home and took that leave, we weren't able to control the depression. And the depression had spiraled down for him so severely that it ended up taking his life just about a year and a half after he got help. And that fear was so salient because it could have been me. Who's to say it wasn't laying in me? Who's to say that if I hadn't started experiencing a mental health issue, I would have done the exact same thing he would? I would have thought it was my fault. I would have thought I was the only one. I wouldn't have wanted to tell my mom, even as supportive as she is. I wouldn't have told my brother. I would have tried to pull myself up from the bootstraps because it was my fault. It was shame, it was guilt, because nobody was talking about mental health or suicide on campus. Nobody was talking about struggling. Nobody was talking about living with bipolar disorder or having a mother with schizophrenia or a grandparent with alcoholism. It was just not a conversation to be had. And so I dove into research, and what I found astounded me. Not only are we not having this conversation on campus, but this is the age group that has the highest prevalence of mental illness. The highest prevalence of mental illness is the age group of 18 to 27. 27% of 18 to 25 to 27-year-olds have a mental illness. 1 in 4 Americans in general has a mental illness. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for college students. And yet the first time I ever heard the word suicide was when my mother called me to tell me my brother had taken his life. That was unacceptable. And so I dove more into the connections that I could make on campus. I joined a grief and loss support group shortly after Brian died, and I came back to school. I talked to the counselors at my counseling center, and I said, hey, I want to do something on campus. There's nobody talking here. Nobody understands this research that I've just learned, and yet people need to hear these stories. My brother Brian needed to know the moment that he started experiencing depression that there were other kids on campus who had dealt with it, who were dealing with it successfully, that there was hope. One of the things that stuck out to me the most was that a week before Brian died, obviously we didn't know he was gonna die at that point, but a week before he died, he turned to my mom and said, Mom, I don't want to be working at McDonald's for the rest of my life. He was working at the Washington Post when he said that. But to Brian, having a mental illness meant it was a life sentence. There were no stories of individuals living successfully with their illnesses out in the public domain. And again, remember, this is 15 years ago. Things have changed. Not enough, but they've changed. At the time, there was absolutely no positive conversation about mental illness, and so Brian literally thought that by having a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, he was going to be working at McDonald's for the rest of his life. Which again, there's nothing wrong with that. Even if that is his path, that's fine. But to Brian, that was it. And he was never going to own one of Trump Towers. And so I ended up starting a student group on my campus, my junior year, called Active Minds. The goal was to get students organizing and talking about mental health and mental illness the same way they talk about every other health issue on campus and every other social justice issue on campus, because this is a health issue and this is a social justice issue. And students organize. And so I started this group to be the place that I thought Brian needed, that I knew I would have needed, to provide awareness and education about mental health on campus. Active Minds is not a support group. What it is a group of students, student volunteers, who all work with an on-campus advisor, bringing in speakers, having panel discussions, movie screenings, stress relief activities, suicide prevention trainings, you name it, to get students talking about mental health as openly and as respectfully as all other health issues, so that other students who are struggling know that they're not alone, that this is a conversation that's okay to have, know what to say to a friend about whom they're worried, and know how to connect with the resources on their campus. Because there are resources on campus, and you ask any student, and vast majority of them don't know where they are, don't know that they're free, and don't know how valuable they can be for your well-being. After I graduated from Penn, I started Active Minds as a nonprofit organization with the goal to develop and support other chapters of that student group on college campuses across the country. That was 12 years ago. Active Minds has been my full-time job ever since. I could go on for hours about the evolution of managing and starting and managing a nonprofit organization with a psychology degree. But what I will say is that Active Minds has become the voice in young adult mental health. I have the notion that I say, if you build it, they will come. We have grown from that one chapter at the University of Pennsylvania to now 400 across the country, including very awesome, strong chapters here in Rhode Island. These 400 chapters are run by 10,000 student volunteers who are dedicating their life's work and their time on campus to mental health education, suicide prevention, name it. We have community programs that you can participate in even if you're not a member of a chapter. We have national programs. We have just over 100,000 social media followers right now, recognizing that this notion of changing a conversation about mental health and sharing your story is something that doesn't just sit on college campuses. This is something that impacts all of us. But what I have seen is the value of the young adult voice. There was nobody within the younger generation who was given the opportunity to share their story when I started Active Minds. And yet the moment that I started my chapter at Penn, the national organization, young adults have flocked to Active Minds because they want this information, they want this education, they want to support their friends, they want to support their families. They want to be change makers in this field that has been so traditionally stigmatized and so traditionally quiet. As you heard in the beginning, we've been fortunate to have quite a bit of national media attention brought to Active Minds, both from, I think one of my proudest moments was that one of the Active Minds, members of the Active Minds Speakers Bureau was invited to the White House Conference on Mental Health to introduce President Obama at the first national conference that's happened in 15 years. We've had quite a few. We have a pro bono PSA campaign running on CBS right now, and have plenty of opportunities for our students especially to be in front of the media, to share their stories, to use events like this to share their stories, to help others recognize that they're not alone. One of the things that has been the most successful at Active Minds, in addition to our growth in chapters, and I shall say we have 400 chapters right now, there are 4,000 colleges and universities across this country, and so our goal is to get an active and vibrant chapter on every single college campus. And in doing so, we also recognize that the language that we use matters. So it's about using the words that are important, that resonate with people, and really help people recognize that mental health is part of our overall health and well-being. We've had quite a few social media successes over the past few months especially, and I wanted to highlight just a few of them. We actually, as we've gone through this session already this morning and this afternoon, many people have touched on this, but there are a few, starting on the left, which has been our most successful social media post that reached 16.7 million people. Depression is a serious illness, just like diabetes or heart disease. Expecting positive thinking to cure depression is like expecting a person with diabetes to lower his blood sugar level by thinking happy thoughts. Join the movement, Stigma Fighter. 16.7 million people saw that message because it was shared, not because we have that many number of followers, but that message resonated with so many people across the globe that it reached more than 15 million people. The next one. It's not bad. It's not that bad. Just be happy. Don't be sad. You'll get over it. You're overreacting. I believe you. We heard almost those exact words earlier, but that message alone reached 1.6 million people. And then finally, labels are for jars, not for people. Fight mental illness stigma. This world, this field, this discussion about mental health and mental illness has to be about our whole overall well-being. My brother Brian needed to hear the message that his mental health disorder did not define him, that his mental health was part of his overall health, that the moment that he started struggling, the moment that he felt alone, the moment that he felt like something wasn't right, he deserved to reach out for help. His friends needed to know what to do. They needed to know where to connect. Our family needed to be able to reach out and help him, and none of those messages got across. Our goal and our role at Active Minds is to get that message across nationally, starting with the young adult generation who is so active and vibrant and wants this information. It is going to be this generation that not only changes their campuses, but they're going to grow, get out of college, graduate from college. They're going to become the practitioners, the policymakers, and the parents of tomorrow. And we are going to break the stigma around mental illness, starting with the young adult generation from today. So thank you again so much for